Hello, my name is Cassandra, and welcome to This Ain't the First Time. This was an idea that I think I had kind of going back to the beginning of the pandemic as it became obvious that this capitalist moment that we find ourselves living in is continuously and eternally just mounting contradictions, one on top of the other, to an extent that cannot be resolved, or at least there's no way to imagine it to be resolved. And so I thought, what a better guest to have on the show for this project than Matt Christman, who has talked about this at great length. Matt Christman is the man who needs no introduction. He is the co-host of Chapo Trap House. His new series is Hell on Earth, which is sort of a spiritual successor to Hell of Presidents, which I found was a very sort of like fascinating historiography of sort of American history through the political dominant eras, of the going back to the founding. And the Kush vlogs. Kush vlogs are famously, all perverts famously love them. I do myself. Do you have any other things that you would like to plug before we start?
No, you covered them. Thank you.
So I want to start off by kind of exploring this sort of famous Hegelian idea, right? Like the owl of Minerva lights at dusk, that it is sort of impossible to understand the sort of, world historical moment that we find ourselves in until, well after it has already taken place. But I do get the sense that there are some predictions that we can be made. I know that, Matt, you famously do not make political predictions anymore because they are just, like in some nothing ether. But I feel like you have made some like general sort of like trend predictions that have been very accurate. And so I guess to start off with the first question, like if a person were to view this moment as moving towards something good, whether it be with advances in the labor movement, limited advances be that they may, gradually increasing senses of social solidarity amongst people in the world. Is it accurate to say that we seem to be moving towards something potentially positive, at least in the immediate term, or is it literally just unknowable? Especially right now?
That's a tough question because it's a question of good, positive for who,
Sure.
I don't think I would not predict any generally positive trend, for anybody. I think that we're in a real crisis, that afflicts a economic and cultural order once it's sort of reached its limitations, and then starts having to interact with a feedback loop from a biological reality that it by definition ignores in its day-to-day operations. So
right.
That is going to cause a lot of pain and misery and death and dislocation, and it's going to give birth to horrifying social organisms.
Sure.
And social realities. But while that is happening, new forms of social identity and structure are also being made that are going to some degree or another, inflect whatever comes next. And that will not be something that everybody gets to participate in, everybody gets to help build, but it is something that the potentiality exists, sort of. I guess that's the way I would say it, is that there is a potentiality that is, I think, already by definition and by necessity being forged, but being forged outside of our ability to not recognize it in our daily lives maybe, but our ability to turn it into cultural awareness, turn it into something that we can translate through the ether to other people, where we kind of imagine that we live, but where in reality we are, kind of trapped in this amber, where all we can do is try to ameliorate the condition that sends us there in the first place, but in so doing only deepens our sense of hopelessness, because all we can confront in that space is that aridness, that end of history sensation, because that's the only reality that can be socially and reproduced through like our media and cultural structures.
Sure, as such that they exist today, absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, and this kind of brings up a thing that a bullet point that I had a little farther down, but just sort of this general sort of, I guess, doomer bloomer sort of dialectic process that we find ourselves in, sort of engaged in online, whatever. While I fundamentally, I think, agree with like the horror of the sort of moment that we live in, the sort of like accelerating techno capital, where like even people who previously would have been at the commanding heights of power, at the commanding heights of power and capital, like Elon Musk, for instance, you know, are so divorced from are so alienated from the sort of institutions that they would normally sort of wrest control of something from. And the reason that I actually kind of see that as optimistic personally is just that we have entered, I think, the final stage, in my estimation, of capitalism being completely unable to resolve even its most basic contradictions. And so what I view as positive out of that is that that system will inevitably bring us into, the hope is into some kind of like spiritual socialism, acid communism, like some similar thing to that extent. But yeah, so given that that is sort of like the horror of the moment that we are immediately in, do you see a viable future for something like spiritual socialism, acid communism, something where the inner souls of our being, are being ameliorated, and not just through sort of like material consumption and things like that as sort of political subjects?
I don't know if it will or not. I think there will be the stuff that keeps us from sort of connecting with our souls, for lack of a better term, is the fact that we don't have to. It's the fact that there is a constant imagined frontier of consumption that can stand in for spiritual transformation. But that is precisely what the contradictions of capitalism are hollowing out right now. And by doing so, it's breaking up like load-bearing pillars of the structures that inhibit exactly the sort of reaching out and redefinition of the self that any kind of liberatory human experience would necessitate. Now, it's also going to unleash horrifying violence as people react to those horizons dimming without having any conception of anything greater to strive towards. But that conflict between those two emergent responses to declining conditions are that's going to form the basis for any dialectical emergence of new forms. And that's why it's hard to talk about one way or the other, to talk about doomerism or bloomerism, because it is inextricable. They are connected. The one implies the other. So that makes it very difficult to tease one out and emphasize it without obscuring the fact that like this is a dialectical process that's going to be doom and bloom at the same time, and that the one thing that you can't depend on is where you're going to end up personally in that process.
Yeah, and so, I mean, yeah, absolutely. I'll say, just sort of to give some sort of personal background to that idea. Like I recently was sort of like snatched from the claws of like one of the worst imaginable outcomes of being a late capitalist subject. I got COVID back in November 2020, and I've had a series of 5 brain injuries over the last 3.5 years, and like 4 of those were like over the span of a couple of months in October, this last October. And so I really kind of, there was a period of time where where I think I was full doomer mode, if you like to think of it that way. But I made this realization. I had a prescription, oddly enough, for Ambien. I took one in the morning thinking like, well, it'll fuck up my sleep schedule or whatever. And I'm just back online now, and so I do think I think that things like that, like your personal experience in relationship to the horror or the joy or the beauty or the weirdness or whatever of this current moment, that necessarily, I mean, colors whether you view the world through like a doomer bloomer, roughly heuristic type deal. But I don't know. Maybe I'm just a hopeless optimist. I think it is. I think it is absolutely reasonable and absolutely rational now, just as it was in the general crisis of the 17th century, to think that literally the apocalypse is here, and in many ways, yeah, absolutely. But I don't know. Maybe it's pointless. Maybe it's pointless to have.
Well, I mean, you have to live is the thing. That's the imperative.
Yeah, absolutely.
Like, if you are going to live, then you are not a nihilist. Like, that's the thing. No one
True.
is actually a nihilist who's drawing a breath every day.
Mm-hmm.
You are structuring your life around goals and values. And even if you tell yourself all day that they're arbitrary, they aren't, because they motivate you to do something. They motivate you to take a step. If they motivate you to do a thing, then they are real.
Yeah.
Like, that is real meaning. So that the entire concept of nihilism is the real cope. Like, people, they love nihilists, pseudo nihilists love to talk about people coping, but there is no greater cope than saying, yeah, every day I do things. Every day my body moves through space. I make decisions. I grasp. I labor. But it doesn't mean anything. No, well, of course it does, or you wouldn't do it. You just are unwilling to accept that, and then you end up living in this twilight zone, this gray world where you are being compelled forward, but you resist the imperative to analyze that and to ask yourself, okay, if meaning is inescapable, then what will I imbue with meaning? And so that is the challenge that we all must do and must take upon ourselves. And that is the very thing that the capitalist subjectivity tries to prevent. It presents the dream that that your least examined urges can be the only real determiners of your actions, and that you can sort of leave everything else to the side, and then the accumulation of those actions will build around you sort of a carapace of commodities that can then reflect some greater meaning to you. And it's that very connecting, that connection between actions and commodities that's breaking down and necessitating this coming back into contact with this vital question.
Yeah. Well, and, to that point about sort of like all of the things breaking down, sort of like leading to these new forms sort of emerging out of capitalism, much like the H.R. Giger, whatever that guy was called, Chessbuster?
The xenomorph.
The xenomorph, yes. But I think that is so true. And granted, I'm going to sort of state my priors here and say that I may be biased in saying this, but I live in Memphis, Tennessee right now as Tyree Nichols. That whole situation is unfolding, getting global attention, support, and things like that. I'm an activist. I know a lot of people in the activist community, and what has really struck me about like daily attendance, because there have been actions, marches, candlelight vigils, showing up to City Hall. Like there's been like 2 or 3 of those a day for the last like 2 or 3 weeks since the video came out, right? And what really has blown me away is just the number of people who come into attendance for a city council meeting, which normally like the gallery seating for city council, like so few people are there at any given time that it's like a 6th floor administrative room with like 5 seats, and they had to move it down into the actual like city hall chambers because so many people were there like, hey, I want this fucking ordinance to be passed, and it, all of that is to say, like I see that in my own community, but I also feel like I see that just sort of erupting just sort of spontaneously, like through these sort of new social forms, like new people just all of a sudden being like, I gotta fucking write my city councilman, like that's just it. It's really beautiful to see. But anyway, yeah. Do you have any more thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean that's where any potentiality exists, and it's not even in people reaching out that way. It is in reaching out and then finding the real limits of democratic involvement in our government. Like, oh, we really are on our own, not in some abstract sense, but in a real sense. Like, if you do seek to command your destiny, it is only going to be by coming together with your neighbors, not coming to them as political subjects, looking to hand off responsibility to elected representatives, but through actual democratic deliberation, horizontal democratic deliberation. Now, that's not. I'm not saying that is going to replace or push aside our political structures, or even that it's going to create prefigurative institutions necessarily. All that it promises to do is to create habits of behavior, concepts of interconnectivity and the self, and relationships, and it's those things that will be our lifelines, one way or the other.
So, one of the things that I find really fascinating about our current moment is the way in which technological intensification is happening, right?
Mm-hmm.
And it is happening at a rate, kind of getting back to your earlier point, where it, like by definition, this process of capital acceleration is like, by definition, disregarding these like bio imperatives and like the human mind's ability to like conceive of like time and information and whatever. But I do think that we are I think we really are coming close to something like a technological singularity. Like I really do think we could see something adjacent to that, maybe within the next like 20 or 30 years. Within my lifetime, I would be genuinely surprised if we didn't. And so I think it's I kind of would like to talk about sort of the information environment specifically a little bit more. So Hell of Presidents, I believe it was the first episode where you guys opened up about Martin Luther and talked about the Wittenberg Press, and how that process of like literacy was like literally reconfigurative to the human mind, right? And so I think on some level we're at this thing where we've gone from the information age to the social media age to the like TikTok sort of becomes everything in the like phone landscape, whatever, and then onto some future like hyper information sludge or whatever that we all communicate through Neuralink, whatever. So do you have, I guess, a forward-looking vision for like what you expect that information environment to look like, sort of going into the near future, medium future, far future, or just at all?
I don't know. It's tough for me because I don't really know anything about computers. I'm too old.
Hmm.
I was not uh, brought into the church, so I don't
You were not
really
a Oregon
understand.
Trail millennial.
I have a very yeah, exactly. I have a very hard time buying a lot of the claims about singularities and shit.
Sure.
Just because it just seems like it's a lot of people trying to big up their own projects, which in almost every
Yeah.
case seem to just be fucking scams. Uh,
Scams or like eugenics in the case of
yeah, like
the race car lady.
just. I mean, Elon Musk is in the middle of self-destructing his
Yeah.
entire career, and people like to say
Hmm.
it's because of his, his need to be liked and his need to be the center of attention. But it
Hmm.
might really be just the fact that he bet everything on creating a self-driving car and has failed completely. So, and there's every motivation in the world to make that work, and they can't make it work.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
maybe there is some singularity that's going to happen. I don't know. It seems to me like it's a bunch of bullshit from guys who uh, it is in their interests to scare everybody into thinking that they've created a Frankenstein that only they can save us from.
Sure.
Uh, so, but yeah, I'm genuinely agnostic on the technological question. I mean, I do know that I
Hmm.
do really think that whatever society maintain, whatever remnant of society is still adhered to the current technological structure, infrastructure we have, is going to be made devoid of humanity.
Yeah.
I think anything that stays within sort of the wires,
Hmm.
the fences around the remaining nodes of capital is going to be
Hmm.
fully emptied of any real spontaneous human inventiveness, thought, art, and only the bodies will be left, sort of carrying out this uh, yeah, hedonic programming in just empty white, uh, sterile
Hmm.
archipelagos of
Hmm.
identical, timeless, spaceless luxury.
Yeah. Yeah. Damn. Absolutely. And I guess I should have also clarified what I meant. So when of course there's pop culture singularity. I fully agree on that. I guess my vision of singularity is just an environment in which information becomes like hypersaturated. I definitely I know that you famously on the Kush vlogs and things joke about uh, a guy 3,000 years in the future hooked up to a MacBook with a
Yeah,
fleshlight or whatever, and
USB
the
stick.
fucking
Yeah, yeah,
USB cord gets pulled out, and he's just like, "Oh,
yep,
there's 3,000 years worth of history just gone."
yeah.
And absolutely. Um, but yeah, but yes, absolutely. I totally agree with I mean, the futility of like the sort of Deus ex machina thesis, right? That if we can just like advance technology enough in a short enough time frame, that will sort of like, you know, bring forth this solution that is unknowable because it really is very difficult to predict, um, especially when it comes to technological advancement. So here is a question that um, has this is a question I think people have been ruminating on for the past. I mean, I think ever since Trump lost in 2020, but even going back a couple of years before that, are the Republicans going the way of the Whigs? And what I mean by that, and sort of the reason that I asked that question, is that like it really seems to me as though with now that we have midterm data from 2022, it 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 was shocking even to me. Like I had a very optimistic case for Democratic performance because I was kind of like the Felix Biederman thesis. It's like
Mm-hmm.
I just don't see like he is a Republican, but like he's also like a Herschel Walker. Like he is a Republican, but he's also like a brain damaged black rapist. Like that's just not good. Like there's just too that is too weird even for Republicans.
Mm-hmm.
And so and so I had a lot of like much more optimistic thoughts going into it, and I slightly overshot, but not by much at all. Like I was very surprised by how close I got, because in the back of my mind there's that thought like, oh, this is all cope, whatever. But with these 22 midterm data coming in, right, and I believe you talked about this on Chapo, where like, okay, great, Ron DeSantis took Miami-Dade County in 15 minutes, right? It was like a 40-point blowout that just nobody's ever seen it. But then the question is like, well, why didn't that happen to Greg Abbott in Austin? Why didn't that happen to Bill Lee in Nashville or Memphis, or like what? And I think that really is a question that I really do feel like I'm watching a party just slowly, just like in its death throes, if that makes sense. What is your sense of that?
Well, it'll be interesting to see what happens with DeSantis and Trump, because there is every reason to believe that if Trump was to not get the nomination, he would just keep running as a third party candidate. And if he did that, he would get a decent chunk of voters, enough to guarantee that the Democrats would win the White House, and maybe enough to crack the Republicans. The problem, though, is that you can only really have parties break up over historically over sectional issues, and the divide within the parties and in America isn't really sectional anymore. It is rural versus urban, basically, with the suburbs as this liminal battleground between the two. And with that being the case, it's harder to see a party breaking up as cleanly as the Whigs did in the 1840s and 50s. I think that what I see in the future for the parties is essentially federalism reasserting itself, competing social frameworks emerging in the different states that have, hegemonic control by one party or the other, and then people voting with their feet, those who can afford to. But with the reality for people at the bottom of the economic totem pole being identical, really, between the states. Maybe the Republican states will make a carnival to, punish and abuse their homeless people, whereas the Democratic states will leave them, to languish with their dignity, but the end result will be immiseration and a continuous slide towards that by everyone who is unable to secure rent. But I really don't think that the parties can break up, because there is no formation to replace them. Like, the Whigs broke up because the slavery issue had become so salient that the Republicans could organize an incredibly diverse group of people, from free slavery Democrats to or anti-slavery Democrats to former Whigs, radical socialists, northern white supremacists, and create this coalition around this issue. That kind of issue doesn't exist anymore. Everything has been subsumed into a culture war that is bipolar and is represented by these two parties very well. And I don't really know if they can be disentangled from that.
Well, so here's a sort of sub question to that. So my thought, and I feel very convinced by your case, but there's still some part of me that is just like, we live in such a bizarre moment where like literally like shocking, unthinkable things are happening like 3 times a day at the national scale. But so the sub question is a realignment, right? I really think that, and this is my sort of thinking on it, and please, I would love to get your insight into this question, because it has been just driving me insane. So on the Roe question, the abortion question, and sort of within that, the like Republican Party is too weird problem, right? I think that uh, if not a break, I think that the breakup is much less likely, absolutely. But I think that failing that, I feel like there has to be a significant realignment, like similar to sort of what we saw back in the 1930s. And the reason that I say that is because when, women and other people who give birth and with like dying in agony on a hospital room floor, not for want of intervention, but for want of like even being allowed to intervene. I think that is, I do not at all, I don't think it has anywhere near the salience as the question of slavery, right? Like that is just, sort of prima facie, that is the case. But I think that even now, after this horrifying loss and defeat, you still have Republican governors and states attorneys general galore saying, we're going to fucking, if you order pills in the mail, we're going to fucking prosecute you. We're going to send you to prison for daring to have a miscarriage, that kind of thing. And it strikes me as this Chinese finger trap that they found themselves in, where they cannot extricate themselves from that because they have a truly psychotic, like hardcore base, which is, like probably less than 15% of the hardcore base for Republicans right now are the sort of like pro-life, like true extremists, and I just don't see a way in which that resolves that is not like, either the Republican Party becomes like a rump party, and, we have like Democratic congressional majorities for the next like 3 generations, whatever, or a realignment happens. So what do you think about that, like as it relates to Roe specifically?
Well, the thing is that we're getting a realignment, but it's along education.
Sure.
The Democrats are becoming the party of people who went to college, but that means the Republicans are increasingly. It's not like a 1-for-1 thing, but it is a trend that you can track a party of people who didn't go to college. Wherever that puts them on the economic ladder, that's what they sort of have in common, and that crosses traditional lines of polarization like race and income.
Yeah.
And if that happens, then I don't see how anything really changes. You keep these two party constituencies that are able to compete for power and basically, trade power as the cycle of economic crises intensify. Because there is no labor issue, there is no labor movement adhered to either party that can cut through and reassert any third dimension of politics. The everyone, if they want to do politics or they want to vote, they sort of have to sign up for some attitude towards culture war.
Sure.
And I think that as weird as the Republicans seem now, and as out of step with the mainstream as they seem now, conditions continue to deteriorate, and their explanation for what's happening in the absence of any other is going to become increasingly persuasive to this new coming together coalition, and that's going to keep the lights on. I think I don't really see anything breaking through this because the labor movement, as we know it, has died as a political force, and if it's being rebuilt again outside of these structures, because the labor movement, the labor unions that were built by the Wagner Act, New Deal era, are now totally enslaved to those structures and are incapable of really confronting power, which is what you would need to reactivate and repoliticize labor.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, there are so many things that go into that. I really do think that kind of just kind of goes back to my optimism, hopeless or not, about the labor movement, because I mean, it is rebuilding its power in a way that is glacial, in terms of like what responses need to happen now to ameliorate these questions. But I really do think that kind of my thesis is that as that continues to happen, right, that you will have even, yes, like, republic, based, formerly based MAGA, like single moms, whatever. Um, I think really will, at the, if not by abortion, as this process continues, like there will come a point. I, I I have to believe it, just so as not to despair, kind of. But I really do believe that as that process continues to intensify and as it continues to worsen and become more violent and literally like more terroristic, the guy from Indiana who got in the shootout in a cornfield, right? Do you remember that?
Oh yeah.
Yeah, I mean, and so yeah, I definitely agree, but I'm just holding on to that hope because I just kind of gotta, like that is just sort of for my own, basically so that I can maintain like the appropriate sense of like, all right, I'm just kind of moving through history and it is moving me. And if I know one thing is true, if I freak out about it, I make it worse. So I'm not going to freak out about it, kind of deal. Does that make sense?
I mean, freaking out about it is, even if you think it's going to happen, is not a rational response, because if you can't do anything about it, you're just robbing yourself of any ability to find meaning and joy in the moment that you actually are embodied in.
Totally.
But and also though, like I don't think that the lack of a formal political horizon should mean the same thing as the lack of a response. Like, the
Sure.
response will just not be legible to the institutions that we've come to expect and assume, and that is where I guess my hope is. I guess I at this point just have
Sure.
a much harder time seeing any of our existing institutions and structures being refilled with anything, because the sociality that they depended on for their meaning at one point has been fully drained of them, and I do not think can be reinvested, because energy reinvested in them now is reinvested from the point of view of isolation. Is definitionally the cry of loneliness and misery, and a desire really to see that misery inflicted on someone else.
Right. Right. Yeah, well, and so I'd like to I'd like for a second if you could elaborate a little bit on a point that you just made, talking about like that is where my optimism comes from, is that it will necessarily come from without these structures, and I think that fundamentally that is true, but if you could just sort of dive a little deeper into that, like what is your optimism for the future? What does that look like?
It doesn't really look like anything. It's more just the feeling I have that there is in my heart a knowledge of what humans are capable of in every respect, and that with the the arc of history, and not even history but humanity, consciousness, sort of extended outward, then the possibilities inherent in that that multiplicity of potentials.
Sure.
To me, it makes optimism, broadly, in not a leap or anything, but just a recognition of reality, a recognition of eventuality.
Of overdetermination.
In order to have that, though, I have to detach it from any specific agenda, goal, vision of the future, because the horrors that would be that are inherently implicit in any positive transformation of humanity are not anything that you would want to root for or see as progress, but are also embedded in any positive vision. So as a result, I kind of just I keep it vague.
Yeah, I do think that there is reason to be optimistic, and I do think that, well, and Okay, so here is actually a question on sort of on that. Do you have a sense that it is happening or that it is possible to happen for people to sort of like at a group level due to the pressures of like living in this immiserating, dying society? Do you get the sense at all that people, just general members of the public, are beginning to have that sort of like understanding of a common human spirit, like awoken within them? Do you know what I mean? Like, I certainly
Mm-hmm.
think that that seems to be happening, but I would really be interested to hear you elaborate on sort of your thoughts on that.
Well, I mean, what technology has wrought is this understanding of the continuity of humanity, and we all try to
Mm,
push against it one way or another to deny it
mm,
because its implications are so terrible and vast and revolutionary, and we
mm,
don't feel up to them, and so we'd rather deny them. But like, the fact that now we can see like the full exertion and expression of the human will and humanity all throughout the globe means that going forward, uh, that knowledge will be threaded through any project. And while a lot of the power and existing technology is going to be put towards the goal of stamping that out and denying it, uh, the ability of those machines to dominate the globe is going to be reduced as the inputs reduce. And the people who left out of that, uh, out of necessity, are going to have to rely on each other.
mm.
Uh, that's all I really have. I mean, any more than that,
Sure.
I can't speak to. Uh,
Yeah.
it's just it's to me it's implicit in humanity, and the alternative is just that it's a continuing and endless cycle of groups coming into uh, power through domination of one sector over another, and then clashing with identically hierarchical societies that are superficially distinct, and then bringing those to common ruin. Uh,
Mm.
uh, and if that's the case, then I still don't think that's the case throughout all of existence.
Yeah.
So therefore, it has happened, and if I get really goofy sometimes, I think it has to happen because it's the only way to explain the existence of humanity, the existence of life,
Yeah.
as the
Yes.
something has culminated somewhere, and we are essentially in the backlash of it, in the resurrected uh, anterior to it,
Yeah.
and that we are part of that process of awakening.
Yeah. Absolutely. Um, my man spitting once again. That is, like, I, I will say too. Um, I think that your point about sort of like it's the only thing that explains like how society comes into being. I know that famously you did not really much care for Grab Grows, The Dawn of Humanity, but
I think
I, huh,
it's got a lot of good stuff. It's just
yeah,
it's the political
valence
angle
of it,
on it is, I think,
yeah,
uh, incorrect. But
yeah,
it was very useful for me
yeah,
in contextualizing a lot of elements of early humanity.
yeah, absolutely. Well, and kind of to that point, and and kind of uh, viewing a lot of the questions that are raised in that book, and the sort of theses about what it means to be human. I think one thing that we're definitely seeing is the death of this sort of like neoliberal sort of like we are all self-interested actors. Like the intuitive felt sense among people that that is true at just I think literally instantaneously vanished once the COVID crisis and all of its subsequent crises really came into being. Um, because at the end of the day, like we are fundamentally a social species. Sorry, I'm getting a little bit distracted right now. My dog is kind of.
That's okay. Yeah, I can hear him in there. He's going ham.
Hello, video audience. This is my little cretin. She is rambunctious.
Oh.
You guys recently got what was it, like a Chiweenie? Was it?
It's I guess a Chorgi.
Chorgi. Oh my goodness. Yeah, I saw that on one of your streams.
Yeah,
yeah, we used to have a Chiweenie. Yeah, and that was such a beautiful moment. But so I guess my question, sort of to that last meandering apologies. My question is sort of like, you know, as it relates to that sort of like inbuilt human desire for connection, right? Like it, I mean, it does, right? Like it overdetermines sort of like a resolution to these crises in ways that are unpredictable. I think is accurate to say. Would you say that? And can you elaborate on that just a little bit?
Yeah. We're at a event horizon where like things are being born that as soon as the sort of the Sauron light of cultural legibility lands on them, just dissolve, because we can only encounter them if something is happening in a specific area, specific people are doing it. If someone outside of that area is to find out that it is happening, they cannot engage with the specific grounded context that gives it meaning. They can only engage with it in the most abstract versions, which means interacting with the very heuristics that act to pull us apart from each other, that act as polarizers.
Yeah.
So it is like it turns into it's like putting it's like overexposing film. It just it just the image disappears. It's only through actual work that you can hold that meaning. It cannot be transferred, and that is what makes it such a scary and disheartening time. And it does require faith to believe in those processes working out. But again, that doesn't require being a Pollyanna. It just requires acknowledging the human drive towards meaning, towards necessity, and the compulsions of necessity.
Yeah, absolutely. So there was actually one bullet point that I skipped over here, and this is something that I have been sort of very fascinated to hear more elaboration on you from. So in some of your Kush vlog streams, or I think it may have only been in one of them, you mentioned it was around the time that you guys were still releasing Hell of Presidents, right? And talking about like the ever shrinking horizons of free real estate as it goes from the beginning of America's founding out to the present day. And so at first it was the sort of Jeffersonian, Jacksonian, every man a yeoman, to the like Homestead Act, everybody, gets a parcel of land given to them from the government. And then you have sort of like the FHA, everybody gets a home in the suburbs. It's sort of a Potemkin farm because like, well, you can kind of feel like you have land. It's green, isn't it? It doesn't do anything, but whatever. And so and on one of your streams, you were kind of talking about that process and the horizons kind of closing in with each step. And what really struck me was you said, I think that is going to overdetermine our like tripping backwards into a UBI as a society. And that thought has really just sort of ruminated in the back of my mind and has been like one of the great sort of like political questions that I've thought about over the last few years, because like on the micro scale, like the sort of Strauss-Howe generational theory, a lot of problems with it, but it is predictive for some things that you get these sort of cycles of crisis and remission and blah, blah, blah. And going by that heuristic, sometime around 2030, if if it continues to be to hold into the future, which who knows anything anymore. But around 2030, we're due for something like that process to begin, similar to like the sort of post New Deal, like going into sort of a new state, whether that's like instead of Levitt towns everywhere across America, it's like, oh, we're degrowthing, but we're happy about it because we've had like a spiritual transformation because we work less and blah, blah, blah. And so all of that is to say, UBI, it is something that I think is going to like have to happen because there is no more free real estate to give away. And, just completely like closing off that process altogether, I think would be so catastrophic that that people who are able to sort of like steer the ship of government or whatever, it really feels to me like would not allow something like that to just go unresolved, with just like a permanent like 50% unemployment rate and all of the like poverty and economic chaos and social chaos that would entail. Yeah. So what are your thoughts on UBI?
I think you're going to see something like that. I don't think it's going to really be universal, though. That's the thing.
Okay.
I think that it will be connected to some sort of existing economic productivity. That this will be part of the broader process of essentially cutting off the bottom tier economically of Americans from really any kind of rewards of citizenship, any kind of rights as we understand them. And part of that will be access to some sort of government stipend. I think Grimes said that it would be tied to like playing video games, and I honestly think that's probably not wrong. That sounds like a solution because it can't really just be money for people. It has to be money tied to actions because it has to serve the function that employment does of disciplining people's time. And having people have to, grind out their UBI in a video game is a very good way to do that. But you'll have to have access to a video game.
Yeah.
They're not going to give you one.
So I'm on disability Twitter. Don't come at me. Mostly just because like I am a disabled person. I've had several brain injuries. I currently live on disability, and that definitely shapes the valence of my politics. I do think that, unfortunately, and also please don't come at me for this, the general sort of tenor of disability Twitter oftentimes can be, I hate to say it, a bit hysterical, but I do think,
oh buddy, don't get me started.
I remember there was the one, this wasn't exactly with that, but it was a very similar thing where it was like the Terragram honk pill 8chan clown world thing. I just thought that was very funny. But, and so on disability, specifically on long COVID Twitter, there's a lot of rumination on the idea of a UBI being like sort of the thing that has to come through to resolve this question because, like that brings up this problem. Like I've had 4 brain injuries in the last 3 months, and like thankfully I have things in place to manage that, and my quality of life is much better than what it is for, I would say, the overwhelming majority of people with more serious brain injury. But there is an undeniable reality that long COVID is a thing, and even at the most conservative estimates of like 15 million long COVID just in the United States, that's 10% of the prime age workforce from, I think, 25 to 64 is the prime age. And I really kind of wonder if it would even make sense from a like biopolitics perspective to tie it to something in that way conditionally, when you have this like huge number of people who literally like are unable to participate in like economically productive society, which of course is just this awful evil heuristic, but it is the one that we live under now and probably will at least for some time into the future. So I mean, on that question, long COVID, I mean, what do you think about sort of like long COVID and what it means for us as a society, let's take a number, 15 million people in the United States. Do you think that that by itself is enough to be like a significant X factor in the evolution of our politics, in the evolution of our social relationships to each other, that kind of thing? Does that make sense?
I mean, I don't really know, because it's going to come to nothing is going to be adjusted at this point. I don't know. I don't know if the argument, like, they'll have to do X or they'll have to do Y because of these crises even works anymore, because
Sure.
the thing that recognize the machine that's supposed to recognize
Right.
those things and then change them is broken.
Yeah.
And there's no way to fix it.
Yeah.
So with that being the case, I think the best bet is always that it's just going to be the same but worse, a worse experience for those who are inside the bubble of solvency, and worse for those outside of it. And the number of people outside will just continue to grow, and they will be managed technologically.
Yeah, absolutely.
And because there's nothing that's going to make anyone change anything about what's going on, because there is no mass movements capable of moving the needle, and there's nothing within the systems of governance and bureaucracy that can push towards effective governance of anything. I mean, look at what percentage of Ohio has just been rendered a permanent toxic disaster area because the government was not capable of exercising minimal safety oversight of railroad. The fucking railroads.
Yes.
The people from the 1870s.
Yes.
Forget about the Silicon Valley or anything. These guys, literally, the choo-choo trains are capable of resisting any necessary oversight to the point where they can just render chunks of U.S. states uninhabitable.
Yeah. No, I mean, I don't know if laughter is an appropriate reaction to that, but you do sort of hear sort of like reality stated in those terms, and you're like, Jesus fucking Christ, America really is burger, like we really we got fucked not by Silicon Valley but by the choo-choo trains. Well, and that gets to, I think, maybe the most immediate sort of political question, the Supreme Court, right? So I really don't. As I went into the beginning of this interview thinking that there would be a resolution, but like, goddamn, it's kind of hard to argue with. Yeah, I mean, the mechanisms for regulating these things are broken, and so, but I still have to just sort of wonder because I wonder if it's possible at that very narrow level of the Supreme Court, jurisdiction stripping, court packing, whatever, and all of these are kind of ancillary questions anyway. But there are state mechanisms of power, and if we had like the anti-Joe Biden president who was like, no, you know what? Hey, you say we don't get an EPA? I'm sending the military to the Supreme Court, and I'm going to be like rolling out new water protection initiatives at gunpoint, but so I know that, like, shy of that, like, this question cannot be resolved, but I have to wonder if at some point in the future, under different circumstances, if, for instance, and this is just a hypothetical, making a lot of assumptions, but it come 2024, we get fucking President AOC, right? Or something similar to that. Is it even possible, given that there are still at least nominally functioning like mechanisms of power that exist there, whether or not anybody will be able to pull them? Let's just assume that it is within the realm of possibility that can happen. Do you have any thoughts on this current situation of this, like, psychotic, fascistic Supreme Court as currently constituted? And is it possible to resolve that? Assuming all of the assumptions that I've just made, is it possible to, at least at that very narrow question, to like at least partially ameliorate some of the most volatile sort of like time bomb questions for like our society? Does that make sense?
I mean, I can't see it.
Yeah.
I like these things have. It's like how the Japanese emperor was all powerful, but if somebody decided not to obey him, then the power disappeared. Like, we're forgetting whatever hypothetical power
Sure.
exists in the executive branch. If it was attempted to be exercised, there would be a response that no one in power is interested or in confronting, or capable of confronting.
And what would that response be? Like, elaborate on that a little more, if you could.
Well, you have the states that are like fully controlled by Republicans. You have a lot of institutions filled with committed Republicans who are not going to just allow some based Dark Brandon to do brinksmanship with executive authority, and they have no interest in seeing that conflict brought to a head. Like the idea, the people that you would imagine doing that aren't in government.
Absolutely.
The people that you're imagining holding these institutions and making them do something like that are not in government.
True.
The people in government have accepted the status quo as the baseline. And that's not people want to turn that into like a moral failing, and maybe it is, but it is not a moral failing of individual members of the political class. It is an inherent and necessary condition to become one, a member of it.
So I think, kind of to sort of wrap this up a little bit, I think it is true that I think you have made an extremely convincing case that these kinds of power games coming from within institutions just is a non-starter. But that there is some human drive towards spirit, towards connection, that will, bring us out of that, or that is the hope. And so I guess with those two kind of things, like very much at odds, to kind of wrap up the interview, are we fucked? Are we fucked or are we not fucked?
Well, again, it's who's we.
Sure.
If you want talking about us individually, anybody listening to this, no way of knowing. That is up to fate. As a group of people that we imagine ourselves to be with like some sort of social destiny, Americans, probably fucked. As a species, I don't think so.
Okay. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and that's, that's absolutely true. I do think it's entirely a possibility that, at least for the rest of my lifetime, that these crises could continue to mount, and that there is just no way of resolving them. Absolutely.
Yeah, that's what I think. But resolution comes from without, always. There's no resolution from within.
Right. Absolutely. Thank you for coming on
thanks for having me.
Little program, and it has been I really appreciate the sort of like you really do have just an amazing ability to synthesize information, and so I appreciate having been able to have a conversation and sort of flesh some of these ideas out.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, absolutely. Ladies and gentlemen of the listening public, this has been This Ain't the First Time. Subtitle, and it won't be the last.